You guys feel free to chime in, and I will give you some information. Really, it's about capitalism between 1850 and 1914. Once again, like you say, we're heading towards a world war. We are directly moving in that direction. And some of these things that you find in the second industrial revolution are going to be some of the reasons why we have some really horrible things happening in the 20th century. I'm going to talk to you today too about booms and busts, and then also new political movements based on capitalism at this period of time. Oh, and I keep telling you about the 1873 crash. I think I get to talk about that today too, finally, a little bit. I'm going to skip this bit about European population and just jump right into new superpowers. Britain and Britain's industrial revolution is kind of the story if you think about the first industrial revolution. And because of their ability to be the first country to industrialize, I think that in many respects is why they are able to be the power of the post 1815 all the way up to, let's say, 1915 period. They are the number one colonizer, the number one imperial power around the world. Well, at this point in time, starting post-world, I'll say this, post-Civil War in the United States and post-German unification, you've got these two new superpowers. Superpowers based on the second industrial revolution. The United States is becoming a superpower, somewhat unwillingly at this point in time, but about to jump into things kind of head first after 1900. The great thing about the United States at this point in time is seemingly unlimited raw materials. It's a huge place that really hasn't been tapped like Europe had been tapped for many, 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 many years, right? Huge raw materials plus an expanding population. Expanding because for decades, we had been taking in immigrants, right? Migration to the United States, and then just natural increase as well. Those two things together really create the United States, set up the United States to be World War I and post-World War I, really the superpower. Unified Germany too, 1871. It is put together, and for the first time you have a large population with some pretty decent raw materials as well. It has a very unified, educated, very active population. They tend to they're like little bees, really. They just work really, really hard to accomplish things. And they have a wonderful system of schools and businesses and governments that are all working together in order to have a successful economy. Britain is still advancing. Don't count them out yet. When the United States and Germany are doing this second industrial revolution, Britain still has most of its eggs in the first industrial revolution basket and is falling behind relative to those other two while still moving ahead. If you're Britain, why in the world would you, jump into all these new industries and new ways of doing things when the old way of doing things and your old industries are still bringing you profit? It's kind of where they're at. This second industrial revolution is kind of like the first industrial revolution where you're like, well, when does this exactly happen? It's hard to say. I'm going to say around 1870 or so and moving forward from there. And it's based on somewhat similar things to the first industrial revolution. They're changed a little bit. So a new metal, steel, which is kind of an improvement of the old metal. What was the old first industrial revolution metal? Iron, good. So it's an improved kind of iron. And then a product is chemicals. Textiles in the first, dyes in the second, medicines in the second, colors in the second. Eventually artificial fertilizers, explosives, all kinds of chemicals for the second industrial revolution. There's also a power source or two that's different, that's improved. We had, I mentioned it, right? The steam engine, steam power. Well, now we have an improvement of that, electricity. And we also have oil. Oil from the ground instead of from whales, that is going to be powering combustion engines. And then we have a whole host of new kinds of products that are based on those things. You have gasoline engines, automobiles, aluminum, the radio eventually, telephones, airplanes, all kinds of wonderful poisons and pesticides and explosives and so on. So a lot of new products that are consumer friendly. I think some of them, just like the first industrial revolution had consumer friendly bourgeois products. There is this process of making steel called the Bessemer process. Cheaper, it makes it more efficient to create it, and that really works out nicely. We had in the first industrial revolution Henry Cort's puddling process. You know, people try to figure out ways of making things better and easier and cheaper, and this makes steel really quite available. And steel is really much better for buildings and large infrastructure projects like bridges and so on, for railroads still, and the railroad engines and machines. Think about this. When do we start to see skyscrapers? 1920s, 19 teens. Okay, one of the first buildings, let's say over, I'd say 8 or 9 stories. Yeah, for sure, New York. And then, do you know that Chicago burned down at one point in time? Mm-hmm. And after it burns down, they rebuild it, and they start to rebuild it using steel structure. Just like in New York, right? They start to create skyscrapers. Really, the United States is the skyscraper country. You don't really have a lot of that going on in Europe forever, until maybe even after World War II. But we're really all about using a steel skeleton and then having these buildings that can be incredibly tall. Well, Germany on the continent is incredibly productive in steel production. There is this Krupp family. You might own something that says Krupp on it, a coffee maker or whatever. It is a gigantic industrial concern, and they make a lot of steel. Eventually, of course, they'll make a lot of cannon and machine guns and so on as well. Germany surpasses Britain in 1893. Around the same period of time that you'll see that the British start to get very concerned about the Germans. One of the reasons is economic pressures. The production increase in steel from the industrial core of Europe, that's B, F, G, and BEL, B being and F and G and Belgium. There you go. 125,000 tons of steel in 1860, and then by 1913, eve of World War I, 32 million. A lot of steel being produced. And once again, steel is, it's a product of war in addition to a product of building. The more steel you produce, the better you're going to be able to produce weapons. Chemicals, like I said, increased production of chemicals. You go back to the first industrial revolution, there's hardly any. Second industrial revolution really is all about that. New dyes to make interesting colors. I was looking for towels this weekend. How bourgeois is that? And, the towels have all these different colors. They're dyed all of these different colors. And before the second industrial revolution, not a whole heck of a lot of color, not a whole bunch of paints available to paint on various structures and so on. New dyes, so the beginnings of plastics as well. Do you wonder what toothbrushes were made out of before they got made out of plastic?
Horsehair.
Yeah, like weird hairs,
Yeah.
Weird actual like boar hair and horse hair, and maybe ivory, I don't know, wood.
they would chew on a certain plant in order to like, I
Yeah.
forgot what the plant is called, but they would chew on it to clean their teeth
Yeah.
when toothbrushes weren't a thing.
Exactly. Strange, all of these things are made of wood, or they're made of ivory, which is really expensive, or metal, and you didn't have very much else other than that. Now you can start to have things like plastics, for better or for worse. Fertilizers as well, eventually chemical fertilizers and pesticides and explosives. All of that coming out of this. And once again, I mentioned before, I think that scientists are starting to be scientists, like you and I expect them to be scientists, working for business, working for government, working for universities, and trying to create new kinds of pesticides or new kinds of dyes or new kinds of explosives. A real business, government, and education partnership. Once again, Germany is a leader in the chemical industry, and this will, in many respects, sustain them through the World War and help them out, sadly, in World War II as well.
Was C4 invented yet, or plastic explosive?
Say that?
Did they combine plastics and explosives yet?
I don't think so. I think TNT is kind of our first thing with Alfred Nobel creating dynamite around this period of time. Not from there. Once the World War breaks out, then of course they're spending a lot of research trying to improve explosives and different things. I like to do this. Maybe you guys at home can see me on the little tiny little square. But electricity is so much more practical, I think, than steam power. Steam power, you have a steam engine, and then it's set up to make pulleys run and sort of like treads, almost like a treadmill, and various machines, and actually making things work. You have to hook up your entire factory and with all these belts and pulleys and so on in order for it to make your whole factory run. You basically turn all the looms or all the weaving devices or whatever in your factory on and run them all. With electricity, it's so wonderful. Watch this. I like doing this. Isn't that fun? With the flip of a switch, it's almost like I'm God, right? Let there be light. And there is light, and it is good. So, and wow, look at me. Power. Where's this electricity coming from? Yes, where though? And what is the power plant burning? Coal? Natural gas. In order to power this. People oil. Some of it could be nuclear from the Prairie Island plant. I think that's down by Red Wing. Some of it could be giant coal burning plants. Some of it could be wind turbines on the way to Iowa. It's so nice. Look at, with the steam engine, where would the steam engine be if we were powering our factory with it? There, right here. This can be far away. And I just want one machine on. I flip the switch instead of 60. Or if I want all 60, flip 60 switches. So it can run large and small machines. It's easily transported by electrical wires. How cool is that? Britain creates an electric power plant in 1881. It's burning coal. Because they have a lot of coal, right? So electric lights follow. You start stringing lights off of that electrical plant, going various places. Same thing with public transportation. You have streetcars, electric streetcars. Eventually buildings are being hooked up to electricity, and wow, it's a revolution. See how this would be our simulation would be basically drawing like streetcar lines in our city, maybe erasing buildings so we could build a streetcar line, one place or another. Loving electricity, it's great. Oil, also really a new way of powering vehicles for the most part, right? combustion engine. First automobiles, 1887-ish. And France, believe it or not, is one of the early pioneers in the automobile industry. I find it interesting, even nowadays, to think about, and this is hard because automobiles are so international now, but I think about countries that have automobile industries that are native automobile industries. You know what I mean? It's almost like a sign of industrial progress to me. Does, what countries have their own original car manufacturing companies? They're all owned by other people now. Germans, the French, Americans, South Korea. That's a really interesting thing. Japan.
Doesn't China make a bunch of cars? But there's not-
China makes a lot of other people's cars. I don't know if they make their
Not
own.
gonna have their car brand and make cars.
Yeah,
China has a lot of their own car companies, but they just don't export them.
there you go.
Romania makes Dacias, I think.
There's some really, Sweden has at least two car companies that I know of that are owned by other people now, I think. But, it's just kind of interesting. Anyway, now they're made all over the world. India, I think, has a car company. So Henry Ford he creates this process of assembly that others start to quickly copy, and it makes the production of vehicles much more efficient once again. But I think that this is an area where the United States is ahead of a lot of people around this period of time, just because of the nature of our country and the roads and all that kind of stuff. But eventually Europeans will catch up as well. Going along with this, the creation of car companies and the oil industry are these huge oil companies. They still exist today, oftentimes with different names, but things like Standard Oil and British Shell Oil and Royal Dutch Petroleum.
Standard Oil, that's Rockefeller.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, and Pennsylvania at this point in time is sort of it's a big oil producing state, and they haven't discovered oil in Texas yet. So, oil. Europe, not a big oil producing place. Europe itself, other than oddly Romania, has quite a bit of oil. This is at this point in time a kind of world market in many different respects. This is what Marx and Engels were talking about, how the world is economically unified like never before. They find that nationalism is going away because of it. They're wrong. Nationalism is increasing in spite of the worldwide economy that's happening. But imagine people are buying products just like nowadays from all over the world. Transportation costs are relatively low, and sometimes people in some European city are looking to buy grain from Minneapolis, from Budapest, or from Buenos Aires, and they're just trying to figure out what the lowest price grain would be that they could purchase and ship into their country. Like I said, transportation costs don't really matter very much. There's a worldwide insurance market, probably starting with Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's was insuring shipping. You could have a Japanese ship, you could have an American ship, you could have a Mexican ship, doesn't really matter. They're more than happy to sell you an insurance policy. If your ship goes down, they will pay for it. There are worldwide markets as well, different stock exchanges that people can purchase stock in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in New York City. Doesn't really matter. Money can be what's the word I'm looking for? Not translated or transferred. Exchanged. Money can be exchanged, and the actual rate of exchange is pretty set because everybody's on the gold standard for the most part. Everyone's currency is related to the price of gold and the gold reserves that they have. This is moving towards is a fundamental change in the economy, that there are new power sources and larger industries that are very expensive. And it's very difficult outside of, let's say, a few billionaires who, or millionaires who are starting to exist in the United States. I think it's really hard to own a railroad or own an oil company as one person, especially, like I say, outside of the United States. And a lot of these oil companies, railroads, giant factories, steel corporations, automobile plants require much more capital than any one person would have. And they start to create what almost seem like countries. Have you ever thought of a corporation as a country? I mean, think about it. They have bureaucracies. They have leaders.
Amazon could probably make their own if they wanted to.
Yeah, it's just, they're so large. They have so many employees that you could really, imagine them as their own country. They need bureaucracies to run them. We looked at, for a moment, at Max Weber talking about the bureaucratization of society. Bureaucracies are a way of organizing things that for whatever reason humans seem to like. Think about all of the new people who, or new positions in these companies, these so-called white-collar workers. They're not blue-collar, hands-on, I'm manufacturing an automobile. I'm a white-collar worker working in the bureaucracy to sell the automobile. Does that make sense? There are a lot of these jobs opening up. Just like in the first industrial revolution, all these factory jobs opened up. Second industrial revolution, a bunch of corporate jobs open up. And so you've got secretaries and telephone operators who are women, who are working, in some ways this is a continuation. They're kind of serving the men in a way, right? The men are on the telephone, and it's ladies, telephone operators, who are connecting the men from corporation to corporation. Or there's all these secretaries who are typing things on a typewriter and then, sending them to other people at the behest of whoever their boss or manager is. But this opens up a whole huge new line of work for women and men in these corporations. The problem is this. You and I are kind of used to this, I think. I don't know if you were pretty young. No. When were you born?
2005.
Yeah. So you were toddling about when the last crash happened, perhaps.
Was there a big crash like less than a year ago?
Yes, but that was due to something else. It wasn't due to reckless investing and so on. It was due to all these places closing. But yeah, you've experienced that. So you know that there are good times and bad times, economically speaking. We're not really sure how to make good times all the time. It's just sort of cyclical. That's what economics is about, and if people could figure that out, if there's a magic formula, then we'd always have good economic times. There's a relatively good economy from 1850 to 1870, the period of time when Nap 3 is in charge. I've kind of talked about that before. Napoleon III really benefits from just being emperor during a good economic time. There is, though, an overproduction of grains in the world market starting around 1870 or so. Overproduction of grains. Farming becomes very capital intensive, I think. It is today, too. When you're a farmer, you buy your seed and you buy equipment and you might buy land and you do all of your farming and you sell all your stuff at the end of the year and you make a ton of money and then you pay off all of those debts. That was happening back then too. They start to create mechanical reapers and eventually tractors and all kinds of other farm equipment. And one guy out on the Great Plains can do the work of 100 Russian serfs with his tractor and with his mechanical devices. But those things cost money that he borrowed money from the bank. Long story short, everyone starts to make more grains to times are good. And that makes prices decrease. And at the end of the year, when the farmers are trying to sell their stuff, they're not getting as much money as they thought they were going to, and they're in economic trouble. If you're a farmer and the price is really low, and you want to try to make up for that, what are you going to do? What are you going to do the next year? Plant more, right? You're going to produce more, which does further depresses it. So this is what's going on for several years. There's a crash in 1873, and then 20 years of deflation, prices going down, and unemployment. This freaks out many people around the world, and they say, how can we avoid these busts? In fact, how can we kind of avoid the booms too? We don't want the economy to be overheated. We want it sort of slow and steady and winning the economic race. So they come up with the idea of state regulations and then integration as well. Britain is really the only country that almost forever, until the Great Depression of the 1930s, is a free trader. They don't throw up any kind of tariff barriers, other than the corn laws for a while there. They like everybody to be more or less a kind of free trader. 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, all the other European states, the United States to some extent, are throwing up barriers to international trade. Another thing that some countries are doing to protect their working class is to set up social insurance, social welfare to protect workers. All that stuff is anti-liberal. Does that make sense? In the classical sense of liberalism. What does the classical liberal want economically?
Freedom.
Yeah, and in fact, that little French, the French phrase, laissez-faire, hands off, right? Hands off the economy, hands off people's property. If people are out of work, they'll eventually find work. Hands off. Or, if they're suffering, they'll eventually not be suffering anymore. So, anti-liberal. Pardon? They'll be dead, so they won't be suffering anymore. Scrooge will be happy. Tiny Tim will be dead. He won't be hobbling around anymore, bothering people. The big companies in Europe start to try to integrate. They start to become bigger. They want bigger corporations. A couple of different ways of integrating, rather than having a whole bunch of businesses relying on each other for fluctuating prices and production and so on. They started to think, well, what if instead of having sort of unregulated capitalism, why don't we purchase everything from the very beginning of a manufacturing process to the very end of the manufacturing process? That's going to be vertical integration. So let's say you're the Krupp family and you want to build warships for the German Navy. You want to own the shipyards. You want to own the cannon manufacturing foundries. You want to own the steel production sites. You want to own coal mines. You want to own iron ore mines. You want to own everything. And then pay each part of your company as that production goes along to the point where you're delivering a battleship to the German Navy. Every step along the way, the prices are controlled, are regulated. Every step of the way, each part of your company is making a little bit of money. They're working together to produce a battleship. Young capitalists, what's the problem with that? What's the downside of that for the customer?
They can make the president how they want to control the entire,
They're the game in town, right? You have to buy whatever it is, and they're setting the price. If you had two battleship companies or lots of coal mines fighting against each other,
They would compete to lower it.
say something about it?
They would compete to lower it.
Yes, along the whole process. Coal mines would be competing, the iron producers or the steel producers would be competing. So lack of competition. There. Woo. Good times. There's also the idea of a bunch of cartels being produced or being created. A bunch of guys who get together and say, like all the people who own coal mines, they get together and say, the price of coal this year for all of our customers is going to be this amount. Everybody sell at this amount. And they all smoke cigars and pat each other on the back and like, yeah. And they, they're getting rid of competition to it, and they're able to make profits. Banks do the same thing with consortiums. They're loaning money at the same rate and so on. We don't like that in the United States. Teddy Roosevelt tries to bust trusts, but it's a way of doing things to sort of eliminate booms and busts. Well, if the companies are getting larger, if the corporations are becoming these mega corporations with thousands of employees, and the bosses are the ones who are setting all of these sort of wages and hours and this, that, and the other, it became obvious to the working class that they need to organize as well. To fight against the power of big business, you needed big labor. Trade unions are a way of doing that. Unions. Workers coming together, organizing, and fighting together for the same wages and for the same hours and for the same policies. See how it's kind of like a mirror image of what the corporations are doing? Trade unions are one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to create a socialist political party that would change laws in order to regulate wages or regulate hours or regulate safety. Get as many socialists into the parliament who are creating law to protect the working man against the power of corporations. That in German, Proletarier aller Nationen vereinigt euch. Last 5 words of the Communist Manifesto. Oh. Proletarians of all nations, working men of all nations, unite. Here's the difference, though. Trade unions are negotiating with capitalists, and allegedly Marxists are set out to destroy capitalism. Right? According to Marx and Engels. Overthrow, seize power, get rid of private property. We'll all hold hands and sing whatever it is that we're going to sing when there's no more government. Because we're all equal and all working for each other. Unions get legalized slowly. And then move from, let's say, skilled workers to less skilled workers. And there's a lot of labor versus capital, or labor versus business unrest. Strikes, slowdowns, lockouts. But this is, I think, why David Ricardo is wrong. I don't think there is an iron law of wages. I think the ability for working people to unite puts pressure on those companies to make concessions and give them higher wages.
What's the United States stance on unions now?
Now, in this time?
Or like nowadays?
Nowadays, generally, I think Americans have been convinced that unions are bad because I think most people, for whatever reason, side with the idea is you're a business owner rather than a worker. It's really kind of strange. But in general, it's thought that unions are kind of corrupt, and that they demand crazy things for the people who belong to the union. And then, coming up with egregious examples to support that. Union membership in the United States is very, very low.
Are they legal? Are they like illegal?
Yes, they're, for the most part. Many states are right to work states, which means you don't have to join the union in order to work in a certain place, which kind of kills the union in a way. Most unions nowadays are government workers and education people. So I belong to a union. I have to pay them a lot of money every year, but it's worth it for higher wages, for me personally. Long story short, or maybe not so short, long story long, regulations from the government, new business organizations, and worker organizations lessen the booms and the busts and encourage stable prices and pretty stable employment and weakens militant socialism. I think it's really hard to be a Marxist and want to overthrow the bourgeoisie when you own a sofa. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you own a sofa, you can lay down and you're comfy. If you don't have a sofa, if you have like a box, a wooden box that you have to sit on, and you want to overthrow everybody else. But if you worked hard and you got decent wages, okay wages, and you can afford a sofa, what's your problem? Right? You have property. And so, you're probably good to go.
And no free furniture and all the local problems are solved.
Yes, something like that. I think I'm gonna stop there and let you ask any questions that you.
On the military side, what started to be made?
Big cannon. Big cannons and then machine guns.
Tanks? Is that
Tanks, not yet. No, but big cannons and machine guns around this period of time, and those are going to be extremely important in World War I. The main killers in World War I. There's also poison gas that they don't think about using yet, but the beginnings of poison gas are around this period of time. They're just using them for other things. No.
what would they use poison gas for right now?
I suppose you could fumigate things, pesticides. Oh, by the way, reading quiz update coming soon. So it's nothing super current, I think. I think the last one that I'm going to be adding is 734 to 740. I think we're way beyond that. Oh, cool.
Yes. I couldn't believe I got it.
Yeah.
I was like, why do you, and then they're like, well, you're a student athlete, so it's okay if we get this one.
It's weird how.
And it works because almost my entire house and team got COVID, but I didn't, so.
Wow.
After the first dose.
Nice. It's such a up and down process.
Yeah.
Random.
It is.
We're all
Like, cause I got my first dose before the Supreme Court justice did.
Huh.
Uh-huh.
They should have played hockey.
Yeah, you got vaccinated before my grandparents.
Uh-huh.
Friends, we're done. You go and have a nice day. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
My grandma's nursing home had too many, so they gave me.
Oh, that's nice.
I know.
It does kind of show how, or like how messy this.
It does, it does.
It's super, super
But
messy.
like, I couldn't pass it on.
Yeah.
Like, let's be
My
real.
mom, my grandma, and I all sat on their computers for like 4 hours straight trying to get COVID appointments for my grandpa and my grandma. And it took so long. Like by the time we got my grandpa in, we couldn't get her in for another month.
Craziness. Yeah, I've heard a lot of anecdotes about
We should really